There's a peculiar irony in modern history. Some of the bloodiest regimes of the 20th century were built by people who claimed they were creating a better world. They spoke of equality, they spoke of justice, they spoke of liberation, yet the result was often censorship, repression, forced labor camps, political terror, and millions of broken lives. Long before these events unfolded, however, a Russian novelist had already begun exploring the psychology behind such movements. He was not an economist, he was not a politician, he was a writer, a former prisoner, and one of the greatest observers of human nature who ever lived. His name was Fyodor Dostoyevsky. Today, Dostoyevsky is remembered as one of literature's greatest masters. His novels continue to be studied across the world for their philosophical depth and psychological realism. Yet many readers overlook something remarkable about his work. Decades before the Russian Revolution, before Lenin, before Stalin, and before the Soviet Union, Dostoyevsky was already analyzing the mindset that would later fuel revolutionary movements throughout Russia. To understand his warning, we must first understand the world in which he lived. 19th century Russia was undergoing profound change. Traditional religious beliefs were increasingly challenged by new intellectual movements arriving from Western Europe. Young radicals filled universities and literary circles with discussions about socialism, atheism, materialism, and revolution. Many believed humanity was entering a new age. Religion, they argued, was obsolete. Traditional morality was a relic of the past. The family, private property, and long-established social institutions were viewed as barriers to progress. The old world had to be dismantled. A new one had to be built. To many educated young Russians, these ideas seemed enlightened and scientific. They believed society could be redesigned according to reason alone. But Dostoyevsky saw something disturbing beneath the surface. He believed these ideologies misunderstood human nature itself. Having spent years in a Siberian prison camp after being arrested for participating in a political discussion group, Dostoyevsky had witnessed human beings under extreme conditions. He had seen suffering. He had seen cruelty. He had seen the darkness that exists within every person, and unlike many intellectuals of his age, he became deeply skeptical of theories that promised to perfect humanity. His concern was not merely political, it was spiritual. What happens when people stop believing in any objective standard of right and wrong? What happens when morality becomes relative? What happens when individuals begin to see themselves not as moral beings but merely as products of economic forces, social conditions, or historical processes? These questions appear throughout his novels, perhaps nowhere more clearly than in Demons, published in 1872. The novel portrays a group of radicals determined to destroy existing institutions in order to create a new society. The characters reject religion, mock traditional values, and embrace revolutionary violence as a legitimate tool for achieving political goals. At the time, some readers considered the novel exaggerated. History would prove otherwise. One of the most chilling ideas in Demons comes from a revolutionary character named Shigalyov, who famously declares, "Starting from unlimited freedom, I arrive at unlimited despotism." It is a paradox that would define much of the 20th century. Movements that began by promising liberation often ended by concentrating power. Revolutions launched in the name of freedom frequently produced new forms of oppression. Dostoyevsky recognized a psychological pattern. When individuals become convinced they possess the ultimate solution to humanity's problems, they often begin viewing dissent as an obstacle rather than a legitimate expression of freedom. The goal becomes sacred. The individual becomes expendable. This concern appears again in The Brothers Karamazov, where Dostoyevsky explores one of the deepest questions in philosophy. If there is no God, what ultimately grounds morality? Although often simplified into the phrase, "If God does not exist, everything is permitted," the broader concern was not theological alone, it was civilizational. If there are no objective moral limits, who determines what is acceptable? The state, the party, the revolutionary elite? History would eventually provide an answer. In 1917, more than 3 decades after Dostoyevsky's death, the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia. The revolution promised equality and liberation. Private property would be abolished. Class divisions would disappear. History itself would be transformed. Yet over time, power became increasingly centralized, political opposition was suppressed, independent institutions were dismantled, religious organizations were persecuted, economic decisions were concentrated within the state. The results became catastrophic. During the collectivization campaigns of the late 1920s and early 1930s, millions of peasants were forced into collective farming systems. Resistance was met with harsh repression. The resulting famines devastated large regions of the Soviet Union. In Ukraine, the famine known as the Holodomor caused the deaths of millions of people, though historians continue to debate the exact figures and classifications. At the same time, an enormous network of forced labor camps emerged across the Soviet Union. These camps became known as the Gulag. Millions of people passed through the system over its existence. Political dissidents, religious believers, intellectuals, ordinary citizens, and countless others found themselves imprisoned under accusations that were often vague, arbitrary, or politically motivated. Historians continue to debate precise numbers, but the scale of repression remains one of the defining features of Soviet history. One of the most important witnesses to this reality was Alexander Solzhenitsyn. A Soviet officer during World War II, Solzhenitsyn was arrested after criticizing Stalin in private correspondence. He spent years in the Gulag system before eventually becoming one of its most famous chroniclers. His monumental work, The Gulag Archipelago, exposed the brutality of the camps to a global audience. While historians debate certain estimates and interpretations within the book, its broader significance is undeniable. It shattered decades of silence surrounding one of the largest systems of political repression in modern history. Perhaps Solzhenitsyn's most profound insight was that the roots of tyranny do not originate solely within governments. They originate within human beings. In one of his most famous passages, he observed that the line separating good and evil does not run between classes, nations, or political parties. It runs through every human heart. This idea could have come directly from Dostoyevsky. Both men rejected simplistic explanations of human behavior. Both distrusted utopian visions. Both understood that evil often disguises itself as virtue. This is where Dostoyevsky's warnings intersect with later thinkers such as Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek. Mises argued that centralized economic planning suffers from an impossible problem. No group of planners possesses enough information to coordinate an entire economy effectively. Hayek expanded this insight further, arguing that knowledge is dispersed throughout society and cannot be concentrated within a central authority. Dostoyevsky approached the issue from a different angle. He was less interested in economics than in psychology. Yet he arrived at a similar conclusion. Human beings are too complex to be engineered. Society is too intricate to be redesigned according to abstract theories. The attempt to create heaven on earth often produces something far different. What makes Dostoyevsky so relevant today is not that he predicted every detail of Soviet history. He did something more important. He identified recurring tendencies within human nature itself. The temptation to replace faith with ideology. The temptation to replace personal responsibility with political solutions. The temptation to believe that enough power can overcome the flaws of human nature. Again and again, history demonstrates how dangerous these temptations can become. Dostoyevsky understood that civilizations are not sustained merely by institutions or economic systems. They depend upon moral foundations, cultural traditions, personal responsibility, and a recognition of the limits of human power. Without those restraints, politics can become a substitute religion, the state can become a substitute God, and human beings can become raw material for ideological experiments. More than a century after his death, Dostoyevsky remains one of the most important voices in understanding the tragedies of the modern world. Not because he predicted specific events, but because he understood the human soul. And sometimes, understanding the soul is the only way to understand history.